And here we are. Welcome, everybody, to the Creative Goo here on Twitch. I'm your host, Harry, and we're going to be talking world building today. Before I introduce our guests, I will share some information about our host and me and our sponsor, Gooey Goo. So I'm Harry. I like to do all things creative with tabletop role playing. Those of you that have joined this stream earlier know that I do miniatures and painting, but I also do other things. I also love to bring in wonderful guests like Adam. So, Adam, I'm going to unmute you and let you say hello to everybody.
My name is Adam Eason. I am a musician by trade, actually. I teach private music lessons and I do gigs when I get a chance. But I also write. And if my name seems familiar, it's probably through GUI Cube's Facebook page, where I post fairly regularly, trying to get interesting art that I like and interact with people there. But I've also done some writing for GUI Cube myself. I've been blogging for a couple years now. My first kind of big project was to try and write a faction for every possible pair of D&D 5th edition classes, trying to find interesting ways those classes could overlap from a kind of faction point of view. It ended up being 76 posts, I think. It was a long, it was a long project. But currently, I'm working on a setting that is kind of a small geographic region, the main city in that region, and then kind of the surrounding environments and maybe some smaller towns and things like that in that area. So I guess I'll start by kind of talking about my process for this particular project. I sometimes look at world building on world building posts on Twitter or Reddit, and I see a lot of really interesting, very detail-oriented questions. You know, what do these people eat for breakfast on the third Sunday of every month? Kind of questions. And those can be a lot of fun to answer, but I found that for myself, if I approached it from let's build a bunch of details and then the details will come together into a world, it just sort of spread out and sprawled all over the place, and it never really congealed into anything coherent. I'm sure there are people that works perfectly well for it. It just wasn't working for me. So instead, I am taking sort of a top-down approach. And part of that, I wrote I call it a setting prompt generator to generate a bunch of kind of random details that then I would try and tie together in ways that make sense. So the setting I'm calling Mayer-Zarotsk. And the first details that I rolled were environmental, purely environmental. From my reading about people and cultures, a lot of it really depends on what's around them, right? So, their technology is going to be bounded by the resources that they have available and how well they can travel, right, to gain raw materials from other people. A lot of mythological symbols are going to be local plants and animals that people in that region would know and recognize just because you walk by them all day, every day. And so I generated through random rolling a kind of coastal region that's got some hills, temperate climate. And then I rolled some additional details for the city itself and ended up with kind of a largish city, not super metropolitan. I thought of it as like medieval London sized as opposed to medieval Paris size. They're kind of separated by almost a factor of 10 or 20 or something like that in the 1300s, how big Paris was compared to London. And then
Hang on one second. We have a question.
Sure.
I know there's going to be an echo, but the question is this a GUI setting or is this your own?
This is my own setting. Yeah, this is a setting I'm writing for myself, and I'm hoping to put it together as a supplement for publication on probably like DriveThruRPG, maybe itch.io, those kinds of places. Yeah, so it's my own personal setting. Anything else so far in the chat?
Yeah, the other question was, do you use World Anvil or other tools, or how are you capturing all this?
Sure. I haven't used World Anvil yet. I'm aware of it, and I'm kind of researching how I might be able to use it. Right now, though, I'm using a program called Obsidian, which I don't even know how to describe it. It's a little bit like a program that lets you build your own wiki, personal wiki. And you make a bunch of notes in the program, and you can title the notes and hotkey them so that you have links to each note and connections across the different links. And you can end up with some. It generates also a graph view showing you all of the titles as like little points and the connections. I can actually show you. I don't know if I can share an image or not, but upload a file. I can maybe do something like that. I'm not sure. But yeah, so currently I'm using Obsidian to kind of help keep track of everything. And of course, my blog posts themselves, I save as Word documents so that I can reference them when I need to. Well, I tried clicking on upload a file, but I'm not sure that it's letting me do that. So
no worries. I think we're good.
Okay. Oh, no, there it is. Here we go. Let's try that. I'm not sure if it maybe sent you something, Harry, or how it all works, but
let me see. Yeah, it's now on my computer. Let me open it up and make it large. Oh, it's still uploading, it looks like. Can you hear me, Adam?
Yep.
Okay, let me check if the group can hear me without an echo. Okay, Adam, hang on one second. It doesn't look like it's moving very quickly on the
Okay, yeah.
So if it does finally make it, then because basically I'm now downloading it. So
Sure. Yeah, I get you. And your bandwidth is getting sucked up by the streaming stuff.
That's okay.
In any case, my next step after an environment and some general city kind of big picture size and connectivity to other places, I also I made a list of like common fantasy tropes, basically cultural tropes. So these are things like cult of the celestial or cult of the beasts for like religions, different kinds of religious approaches, different types of magic, so like illusions or necromancy or enchantment, things along those lines. And then a number of kind of types of political groups, so guilds or nobles or um, a variety of different kind of political groups along those lines that are a little bit more mundane. And I generated a list of these cultural elements and started connecting the dots, trying to make something out of those and see what would make sense.
So I'm going to test my voice again. Can you guys hear me? I want to make sure I can communicate and answer all your questions. And I do have a question for you, Adam. When you're doing your world building, how high level do you start versus low level? Like, are you creating the gods and the pantheon, or are you building a town and figuring out who the mayor is and who the people might be interacting with?
Well, for GUI Cube, it was nice because there's already a lot of stuff worked out. So I just had to try and think like how a particular region might reflect these sorts of themes that are being presented by Alphinius and the rest of the writers, what they've already kind of established. For myself, I'm actually starting even more conceptual than even like kind of making a pantheon or any kind of mythologies like that. It's more like what kind of themes am I wanting to explore with the world? And what kinds of I guess what kinds of conflicts would I want to try and bring across with the world building? Since world building doesn't really, I mean, you can do it as an activity unto itself, but usually you're world building for something else, either for your own story writing like Tolkien, or for tabletop RPGs or a video game or something like that. And so the world that you kind of create is going to encourage certain kinds of conflicts or certain kinds of storytelling based on the content of that world. So I was kind of thinking, if I'm writing I'm writing this setting, I'm trying to keep it as setting or system neutral as possible. So it wouldn't matter if you were playing D&D or Pathfinder or, I don't know, Blaze in the Dark, the Forge in the Apocalypse, something like that. You'd be able to kind of plug it into whichever system you're comfortable with and use the setting as a kind of launch point for your campaign. And, one thing that all of these systems kind of have in common is, there's violent conflict. D&D, Pathfinder, they're basically, they're beating little heart, they're war games. So as I was writing this setting, that was something I was keeping in mind, was like, well, what kinds of things might lead to these violent conflicts that you have in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you make a map? I mean, I saw the diagram part of it. The download actually failed. So technology hasn't been our friend today, which is all good. I can show people maps that I've done with different tools just to talk a little bit about world building. But so you've got this concept you want to do. You know there's these conflicts. You're building a world around these conflicts. So, what about the world building then is driven by that? And how much visual? I mean, do you download images from the web? Do you
Right.
make your own maps? I mean, what's making your creative juices flow?
So I am not a visual person at all. I actually recently learned about the concept of aphantasia, like lacking a mind's eye. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of like me. Like if I closed my eyes and you told me to imagine something in my head, I wouldn't be able to really visualize it. So most of what I'm kind of looking at is more driven by, I guess, ideological conflicts, right? So the worlds that Mayer-Zarotsk, there's a big central religion that's kind of the dominant religion. And as I was writing, there's some little sectarian splinters coming off. There are kind of remnants of old religions that are still kind of simmering around. There's also noble families, and illusions are a prominent part of the world. And so these noble families, like, things have kind of come together into something like a geopolitical unit, but it's still very fractious. And the noble houses are still very paranoid of each other, and kind of angling for power, and lots of resentment from how the war shook out and how it resolved, and who's king now versus what it was before this kind of unification.
Yeah, and conflict and things like that actually drives both storytelling but also adventure. So, I love that, and having those hooks that you can tell a story around or tell an adventure, and that sounds really good. We have a very, very important question for you,
Sure.
which is, do wizards wear hats in your world?
I will say yes. When I publish the supplement, there's a bunch of details that I will leave open to however you would like your wizards to present themselves and comport themselves. But I think hats are pretty important element of.
So for those of you on the stream that aren't, part of the GUI family, I brought some people in. I'm sure Adam's brought some people in that may not be GUI. There's a big debate in the GUI Cube's Den of Enlightenment on Facebook about whether wizards wear hats or not. And there's a whole group on the side of no hats necessary, of course, in your own game. And, this is all in good fun. So finding a hatter is always a good thing. And somebody just said something I love, which is, my hair is too epic to cover in a hat. So I like that a lot.
That is absolutely fair. If you got it, flaunt it. 100%.
And then, but there is another question I thought was really interesting from Belinda, which is, how do you check yourself to make sure your world building is unique enough and it's not a rehash of history or media or something, or system? Maybe is it too much like the Forgotten Realms, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, how do I put this? We sometimes talk about tropes as writers, and sometimes it's usually brought up with an element of derision that is like, oh, these tropes, they're so common. But the more I read and the more shows I watch, it's a little bit like saying, I'm a cook, but I don't use recipes, right? I don't, I don't use bread, right? Or something like that. The concept of these kind of food categories or whatever. Um, and, tropes, I think, where you get into things that feel very generic or very samey, what's usually happening is the author isn't deviating or embellishing the trope to a degree where it starts to take on its own character and personality. So I think, as an example, in my world, there are a few fantasy worlds that have multiple moons. Zyathe is one. But one of the things that I really wanted to focus on, based on a Twitter poll, was tides, right? I asked Twitter, my Twitter followers, hey, what kind of cult of the celestial do we have? And I was like, do they focus on the moon? Do they focus on the sun, the stars? And then, just as a lark, what about tides? Because they are related to these celestial bodies. And tides won, like, handily. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, Zyathe has a couple of moons. I forget what Critical Role's
there's a couple of moons there
There's
too.
a couple of moons there.
Alexandria, I think, is the world for them.
And
they have a couple of moons too.
And then the Dragon Riders of Pern.
And McCaffrey, yes.
Get into the Wayback Machine in my brain. But none of them really focused on tides. And so I was like, well, if tides are a central element, what kind of things can I pull from tides? How would that affect the environment around them, around these people? What would that mean for their beliefs about how the world formed? And of course, it's always a little weird with fantasy religion, because in fantasy worlds, gods are usually actual, real entities, right? So it would be like, here's how the world formed, and it's about, these tides are an important element of it. So I think that's kind of what I try to do, is like, yes, there's a kind of underlying set of tropes, like this, the Church of Tides, Aolam, I call it, is, kind of got the sort of hegemonic, evil empire sort of feeling to it. But how Aolam sort of expresses their religious beliefs, how they like the kind of rituals that they use, and how they marry or bury their dead. You get into these details that are very, like, again, it's sort of embellishing, like, okay, I have this big church. All right, next embellishment down, our tides are a big part of it. Next embellishments down, and you start to, I sort of actually think of it like almost carving a sculpture. You kind of take the big block, and then you make the general shape, and then you start getting the little details in from there. And you do that enough, I think eventually you'll end up with something unique. Just because, the more detail there is, kind of by definition, the less generic it becomes. And you kind of helps push you away from other worlds and kind of getting too much overlap and similarity.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, it's a different thing where the reader needs to be able to connect, or the gamer needs to be able to connect with your world in some way. So if it's too alien, too different, they're not going to be able to connect. And like having pre-gen characters or having archetypes, fighting man, wizard, etc., those are important things for people to hook into, so that you can tell your story. Because if you have to spend all your time explaining, then you're not getting to your story. And absolutely. So, I think you're right. I think there is a balancing act there, and people do want it to be different. But if I've read a lot of books over a lot of years, and they all have something in common. If you're talking about the fantasy genre in
Yeah.
particular, they all have, and I could spend a whole session just talking about that. But
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to make sure you had as much time as possible. So tell me about magic in your world. Is that a major part of your world? Is it a little thing? I know some people like to make magic is special, magic is different, or magic is everywhere. Like in the world of Eberron, um, magic is just part of everyday life, like technology is for us in the 21st century. And just love
Sure.
to get a feel for what you think about that and how it ties to this world you're building.
So um, I personally shy away from magic as like a system, just as a personal preference. So thinking about Tolkien or maybe Earthsea, like the only thing that's really explained in Earthsea about magic is it's connected to your true name, right? But beyond that, it's still kind of a mysterious force. um, the the way it's kind of being expressed in this world, and it came up a lot when I was writing these factions, was the idea that magic is something almost like radiation, that it sort of comes from the world and people absorb it just by being around it. And so that led to some interesting thinking about, well, to me, interesting, that you have geographic regions where certain types of magic might be more prominent than other types of magic, simply because that's the type of energy that's bubbling out of that area. Maiar Zarotsk has a very prominent illusion magic sort of central to how this region works. And to be clear, when I say region, I literally mean it's just like a peninsula. It's not like the entire world,
Okay.
like a globe. And so illusion magic, super common, shows up in its use for art. I had the idea that maybe the Church of Tides uses illusion magic for these moving stained glass kinds of things to show the illiterate people, and hear the important stories, just like the kind of Catholic Church, that's kind of what stained glass windows are for, basically.
Create a mood. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that definitely informs like these noble houses and how they approach conflict, right? Because it's a problem. You don't know necessarily who you're talking to. And so, how do you confirm that the person you're talking to, sure, it's illegal to take on through illusion the face of somebody else, but, it's going to happen when you've got people who want power bad enough. So illusion magic kind of informs everything. And there's just this kind of simmering Cold War. It's very espionage based more than overt hot conflict, although it could certainly turn that way. Necromancy also showed up in my prompt role, and it's going to be interesting here. The Church of Tides has a thing about reincarnation. So souls transmigrate to the sea and come back with the tides. And so, I was writing about, well, how might a necromantic faction or minor religion might interpret this kind of movement. And they probably think it's unnatural. Souls are supposed to stay gone. So I have a kind of minor faction that's running around not reincarnating, but like reanimating corpses, because they think, well, if their corpse isn't dead, their soul can't come back. Their soul will still stay where it's supposed to be, kind of situation.
Cool. So
Yeah,
Belinda has another question,
go
and
for it.
you started answering this earlier, and I know we had some audio issues, but how early are you thinking about the monsters, maybe the species that are part of this world? You know, if there are dwarves, for example, or if it's all humans. And then what about stats for those monsters? And do you have ideas about that? You know, how are you structuring that in your world building?
Mhm. So very early on, I decided that it was going to just be humans for kind of the general population. If other people who hopefully buy the supplement and use it want to bring in elves and dwarves and things, they can do that. There's room for it, but just as a kind of default. Um, as far as monsters, I think in this case, I was really waiting. I'm really waiting for things to kind of develop. And I actually recently, my most recent blog post was about 3 devils in the area who are kind of major players. And uh, I wanted to write them in a way that still felt connected to the cultural elements that were there for this population. Um, and so, these devils are a reflection of certain, maybe certain cultural values turned monstrous. So um, the Zarotskis are very much about steadfastness and loyalty and, kind of this hierarchy. So one of the devils takes that and is like, well, what if it becomes its own kind of monstrous thing where you end up sucked in subservient to this devil for the sake of like protection, right, is the selling point, right? And then you find out, oh, you're getting trapped in this kind of exploitative uh, uh, devil layer sort of thing going on. Um, so yeah, in this case, I was wanting the monsters to kind of reflect certain things about what kind. I was imagining what kind of fears might these people have, what kind of pressures might they be reacting to, um, and when I was writing the environment, I mean, like I said, it started with hills and a coast. But as I wrote, we got like this big swamp region. The hills kind of took on a new character. I added like a river for extra interest. And, the monsters too should fit into their environment and kind of because they're adapting to that environment, right? So um, I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess there's no reason why you couldn't have oozes in like these dry mountain regions. It might be interesting, like as a like, oh, why is this here? But it's not like the first thing you think of. But for swamps, it's like, oh yeah, absolutely, oozes could definitely be a thing for swamps. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of it is the purpose of your story and what
Mm.
you're writing about. I've worked with people where the deadliest enemy are the other people,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And so, very much focused on the interaction with the people, whether it's a human based world or whether there's other species. And or is it there's a lot of wilderness, like in the world of
Sure.
Zayate, there's a lot of wilderness and there's a lot of things you interact with in that wilderness that generates this monster trope. But you don't have to tell stories that way. And certainly if you're telling a story, it's going to generate one result. If you're creating a game world, it generates another result. The other thing I was going to talk about is I have my own worlds that I've done. I'm currently running in Zayate, and I'll probably do that for quite some time. But I have another world. And when you're using it for gaming, the players have a significant impact, right? So I actually had very few species to start with. I didn't want 25 different species, trying to figure out which culture's which and things like that. So it was pretty much just 3 or 4. But somebody came to the table and they wanted to play a half orc, which actually wasn't even in my world. I didn't have orcs. So it was very goblin centric. And with that half orc in the group, I actually changed part of the world. So there was this area that was dominated by these primitive humans, and I just turned them into orcs. And we created an entire storyline around that region because it mattered to that player and his character. And so when you're gaming, world building is a group effort. And so everybody should remember that when you're creating a world that you want to publish or to tell a story, you're creating a framework for other people to do what they want to do. So it's your vision, and then they take it and run with it. And that's definitely what GUI Cube has done with the world of Zayate. And it sounds like you're creating this really nice framework where there's conflict, there's logic behind where the magic is. All that's really good. And so that's really exciting. I do have another question, and this is really neat, and it's from Belinda again. Naming convention's a big deal. Like, what names are you using? And it's usually drawn by languages. And so she was asking if there's language bases that have influenced you. How are languages impacting your world? I think that's a really interesting direction to go next. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So when I first started blogging, the way I approached generating names was to think of a couple of relevant descriptors for the faction I was writing, popping it into Google Translate, getting a couple of words, and then just sort of like remove letters, pop letters in, try and get it like away from the result, so that if somebody actually spoke that language, they wouldn't look at it and go, in this case, there's, Mayarzerotsk. There's a little bit of a sort of Celtic-ish flavor. There's a little bit of a Russian-ish, kind of Eastern European character to it. I was thinking the vowel sounds are all going to be very uniform, right? So you don't have a lot of variation in how A is pronounced, as an example.
Oh, don't you like the English language? I mean,
oh, I love English and how it it's kind of crazy.
You can make anything work, right?
Yeah.
So I love that, and we're getting positive feedback in the chat on that too. So I like compound words, and then what I will do, similar to what you do, is I'll translate it into another language and find good compound words. So there's still that meaning. Like I see other people do it. There's a product or a game world besides that they call Grim Hollow. I mean, very evocative. You get an idea of what it's like just with those two words, and I try and do that too. And so a lot of my names are simple that way, and so people have a feel for just by using the lyrical English language.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's, if I want the star C, that seems kind of boring. So I'll look up a word that sounds cool from the 200 and some languages available in the world.
Right.
And make that the name of the C. And so I like that. And then the fact that you're switching letters around just to change the sound maybe, or how it might be pronounced, or make it easier to pronounce for the reader, that kind of
thing. For sure.
Very cool. Now, do you have multiple languages, or is everybody speaking the same language?
Currently, everybody's speaking the same language, but they are a port town, and they do a lot of trade. So other languages, I'm going to have to think a little bit carefully about that, because the focus of the supplement is going to be on that region. So how much detail do I really need about these other places that they trade with? Not much, right? But some references to, hey, there are these distant lands that they trade with. They get such and such from there. They get such and such from here.
Yeah, just
And
having
it's
a
one of those things.
sidebar for trade, here's the name of some
Mm.
places and here's the goods from those places and your gold, right?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
One of the world building tips for those of you that are still with us and weren't scared off by my echo um, is create the world that you need, right? You don't need to document a globe,
Right.
you just don't. And then start relatively small. And so in this home world that I built, I had some legends, I had some history, and then we started in a little town, maybe 200 people, and they adventured for a really long time around that place. And
Yeah.
I want to say, in real time, probably a year or two before they went to another town. I mean, it
Mm.
was just all there. And so I had names of cities that they'd hear about, but I didn't have to detail who was the mayor of that city and the city council and, the trading guilds, because they just didn't go there. And that's a world building tip you get from a lot of people is document what you know. And if you're starting a new story, start small, and then as they explore, that's what you add more detail to. So, quick sidebar from Harry, and back to Adam. So, what about slang and lingo? Do you have any of that in your world?
Currently, no. When I've encountered it in literature, it's hard to do without sounding really stilted. Um, because, like, you still say the words in the context of we're still speaking English, right? So it stands out in a way that maybe um, is a little uncharacteristic or makes the flow feel odd. Um, and I also kind of think, you can end up with Clockwork Orange syndrome, where you need like a glossary for all this stuff that you're doing.
Yeah,
Um,
what I've seen done well for that is same kind of thing. It's a sidebar, right? Where you say, here's
sure.
some common slang, here's what they mean, or here's how they're used. So if somebody's thinking about it or they're playing in the world, they can add it. But you're right, when you're writing the story, you need to avoid the slang, right? So that the narrator certainly is not going to use it unless you really want to narrate from the point of view of Ishmael.
Yeah,
But
yeah, sure.
um, but that's really a great thing. And so the people that want to lean in can, and you could maybe have some quotes, from a character, like when they go to the port, they hear, this conversation between somebody and you've got the slang there, but it's not central to what you're trying to share. I think that makes good sense.
Sure.
So in this world, I mean, you're looking for people to play whatever rule system they're using, right? So
Sure.
and I like that. In fact, most worlds should be somewhat agnostic from the system. Now you need to decide, okay, how do I describe magic? And sometimes you're using words that are system specific, so
Sure.
you do have to be careful around that. But if I'm going to play in this world, what's going to draw me in?
What's going to draw you in? Well, it's going to tend to be more political intrigue. It's going to tend to be more espionage focused, cloak and dagger kind of situations. I know sometimes D&D struggles with that a little bit, but I honestly, in my experience, wonder if that really comes down to players being very hesitant to split the party. um, and there are problems with running a split party as a DM, but when my tables kind of split the party and done different things, some really cool stuff happens. So, um, and then like I said, there are also these devils that bring in elements of temptation and darkness, which can always be a fun thing to fight against or grapple with as a character. Like if you have Blades in the Dark features your vices very prominently, right? So if your character, if you're wanting to run a table where a character's vices kind of plays a role, then this might be an interesting one where you've got these devils kind of tugging in different directions for different reasons, and trying to get people off the adventuring path and into the maw of the abyss or whatever.
So you have obviously the political maneuverings of the mortals, right?
Sure.
And then you have this group of tides or cult of tides, religion of tides. And then you have these devils. Are there angels? Are there influences on the positive side, or maybe more morally ambiguous or neutral, or is it just corruption and evil at every turn?
So the way this is shaping up, it's a rough place to be. I think that there are, positive gods. I think that the situation is maybe the church has more corruption problem than like the gods that they worship. That maybe there's deviation from what the gods would want of their church. And there's also I guess this is somewhat Ziathe inspired. And this is, I think, kind of showing a very pessimistic, maybe almost nihilistic sort of viewpoint of this apocalypse moon or comet or some kind of eldritch being that comes by every few thousand years and just sort of levels the planet. And, there's big upheaval, civilization kind of almost restarts, and you have, people scrabbling to survive in this kind of giant environmental apocalypse and then rebuilding afterwards. So, that's, maybe not something that you necessarily have to focus on, but it might be interesting. I'm planning on including some pages for like, okay, if you want to run like here's the apocalypse moon kind of campaign, like this is what would happen in this region. These are the kinds of eldritch monsters that would crawl out from the seas or fall from the skies or whatever. And but yeah, this is definitely going to be more on the morally gray at best. I don't think it's going to get quite grim dark, where everything is misery. I think that in general, things are pretty stable at the, for the general population.
So it's not nasty, brutish, and short.
No, not really. I think generally things, it's relatively prosperous for the people.
Okay.
But yeah.
And there's another question. So are the gods active, or are they just talked about and worship, but not really seen or interacted with? So like on Zaate, they're very active.
Right.
Low-level characters are getting messages from the gods, right? So they're either chosen or they just get to interact. And of course, D&D makes that a reality anyway with the way they structure clerics and their actions.
Yeah, exactly.
Gods. But so the playing Dungeons and Dragons drives that to be more active thing.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but what about your world? Is that, are they there, or are they also waiting for the apocalypse and counting down the minutes?
Yeah, it's sort of a curious thing to think about. Like, if there is this apocalypse every few thousand years, what about the gods? And I'm kind of currently taking an almost Jungian approach, where like the beliefs of the people coalesce into the supernatural elements that then begin to feed back into it. So that's like, for example, where these devils arise, and the gods are probably going to be in a very kind of similar space. They're there, but they're not like D&D's main pantheon, where it's like they are the foundation of the world, right? It's more that they're an outgrowth of the environment that they're kind of associated with. But yeah, they'll be relatively active, I think, but maybe not like to the same degree as Zayase. There's going to be some distance there.
Okay. What tips do you have for someone that wants to maybe take your world and change it or start from scratch? I mean, maybe talk a little bit more about that journey here in our last few minutes.
Sure. So if you're taking somebody else's setting and you want to run a game with it, I was asking around, is like, how many people play settings like by the book? And the answer is very few, actually. Most people kind of pick and choose the bits and pieces that work for them. The map obviously stays pretty steady because it's sort of hard to change that. But, as you play the game, you're going to come into situations where you have to make an NPC that's not in the book at all because the players have done something that nobody could anticipate. And so suddenly Noblin the Goblin's around and, becomes a party mascot and like a huge plot point for a 3-month campaign arc. So, if you're using somebody else's setting, absolutely just kind of cannibalize it, right? Take the bits you need. But I think it's important to like at least try and hew close to the tone and ideas that the setting is trying to bring across, right? So, Forgotten Realms is very much high adventure, high fantasy. You're going off to fight monsters and loot ancient dungeons and things like that. And so like introducing kind of, like a political marriage into that kind of situation, maybe as like a side point, like part of the world, but not as like the focus,
Right.
That's not what the table's there. For your own world building, I think that, kind of looping back to the beginning of what I was talking about tonight, is very easy to get bogged down in details. Your job as a writer is going to be figuring out what are the most important things. You have 3 hours, 4 hours with your table, which sounds like a lot until you start playing, right? And then it just goes by like that. What are the most important things that the players need to see, know about, and guide their decision making, right? Guide their motivations. Once you kind of, they're sort of like big signposts. And then once you've got your big signposts in place, then you start kind of fanning out, I think is probably the best approach for starting at the beginning. Because it's fun, right? You get all these questions like, oh, what would the guards be like here? Oh, what kind of mammals live in this region? What kind of, plants grow there, whatever. But is that really what your table's going to be interacting with?
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, maybe. And so I'd add to that, and I agree 100%. And you want to create things that they're going to interact with, right? So maybe have a little bit of that, maybe the names of some trees or some herbs that they might find that are different than what they would find in our world, right? And then you let the detail grow as it comes up. So if someone playing an herbalist, right? They're going to be more interested in those things. But if nobody's playing an herbalist, when does it come up? So you're doing things that you don't need for your game or your table. The other example I have is if there's a god and a religion. Well, if there's a cleric that is in the party, let them detail what that religion's like. Let them talk
Absolutely.
about what it means to be a field cleric versus a cleric in, at the big church. And so they're helping you develop that world, much like the half orc story I told earlier, right? That became part of that character's arc. So there was no plan to even use that region in the campaign until after that player made it important, right?
Yeah,
So
and that also has the benefit of helping your player engagement, because now they have something, like they have a stake in the world, right? So yeah, you just want to make the things that will, I guess, make emergent creativity possible, right? Kind of be, maybe lean more on the side of evocative than specific for tabletop RPG setting writing. And people are creative; they'll find a way to make your world work.
absolutely. And it's okay to not have an answer in the moment too, right? So either take a 5-minute break if it's important to the moment. Otherwise, just detail it up and then make it part of the story in the next session. Like they say, oh, what's the next town down the road? Well, in my notes I have it's called Alderwood, right? It's like, well, we want to go to Alderwood because we heard that Jack is from Alderwood. Great. Next session, we can head to Alderwood. It's just not going to happen right now, unless you're really good at winging it, which is possible. And then you have to take really good notes. Okay, I introduced these 3 characters. I gave them these 4 names, and now there's stuff that's happened that you need to make. Now it's part of your world. Like you mentioned, that a character becomes really important if they save the goblin that had the limp, and now they want to kind of adopt him into the group. And it's like, because all the other goblins were picking on him. Well, now Gimpy, or whatever they name him, is now part of the group. And so you tell a story around that. And really good stuff. And I think the same is true if you're writing a story, right? I mean, yes, there are people that create their entire world and then write the story next. But I'm of the school that you start the story and then you add the backstory later. I mean, you have a framework, right? So what's it all about? But it's an outline. It's a couple of pages maybe, and then you're writing the story. And then maybe I need to do more. Maybe that dwarven hold is more important, and I need to detail it better. But I let the story drive those details. And again, if I'm just writing all this exposition, is that going to be interesting for the reader? Just like, is it going to be interesting for the player? You want the lore to be evocative and then let the questions come. Like if you say Alderwood's the next town and they're like, okay, great. And they go back to what they're doing. That's all you have to do.
Yeah.
If they say, hey, we want to go there and we want to meet, that metalsmith because we want to make a special sword. Okay, now I've got to detail the metalsmith and what swords can he make, and are they magical or not? What else might they find on the road to Alderwood? What might happen? That's great for me as a GM because now I can go do that. Now the story continues. But you want to let the players drive what's interesting. And I agree with you, even when I'm running a published adventure, I'm in a published world, it's becoming our world as we play through it because we're making changes. And our experience is different than other people. I even run games at conventions, and they change each time I run it. Like I ran the same adventure 4 times at Gen Con, not this year, but last year. And it was different every time. I mean,
right. Yeah, absolutely. The different players are going to focus on different things and different elements. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. Like, like I said, emergent creativity and getting used to the fog of lore, like the empty spaces that they're not really empty, but they're kind of zones of potential. Maybe players go there, and if they do, you can start developing it and let something grow. But if they don't, that's fine. They've gone somewhere else. So yeah, having spaces of maybe ambiguity is not the right word, but yeah, just like openings for stuff's here. Don't be afraid to plop like a little village in this area just because it's not in the official map, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's part of the storyline. Or change the names to protect the innocent. So
Yeah.
you've got all the details for a different town. Well, you just move it over. They've never been there, so it doesn't matter. And then you can detail town one, another day. And Alderwood now has, an inn, a somebody that makes wagons and somebody that's a metalsmith, and then the sheriff of the town needs help, right? So that was what was going to happen at the other town. Now it's happening here at Alderwood, and there's lots of options for changing the world around as you go, and really good stuff. Well, we're actually past the hour, so we've gone a little long. And we're getting thank you Adams in the stream, and I wanted to thank you very much for joining me with all the technical difficulties we had. I think we had a great conversation, and it was.
Thanks for having me.
I loved hearing about this world you're working on, and once once you have it ready, and it's going to be on, RPG Now, wherever you put it. I'll put it in the links, and we can let people know about it. Maybe bring you back to talk about it again, and that would be wonderful. Great. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you next week. I'm still working on the topic for next week, but it's going to be great, promise.
Nice.
And Adam, you have a great evening, and everybody on the stream, thank you very much, and we will see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. Good night, everybody.